A place where the faithful came to cleanse their souls. For generations, it had been a sanctuary, a site of purification and renewal. But lately, something had changed. The air around the mikvah felt heavy, and the once clear waters seemed darker, as if tainted by an unseen force. People whispered that the mikvah was no longer a place of safety, that something malevolent had taken residence within its sacred walls. Those who ventured near spoke of a chill that crept into their bones, a feeling that they were not alone. They talked of shadows that moved on their own and of whispers that echoed in the night, soft and unintelligible, yet filled with an unmistakable sense of dread. No one dared speak of it openly, but the fear was palpable. The community, bound by tradition and faith, chose to ignore the signs, to believe that the mikvah remained a place of holiness. But deep down, everyone knew that something was wrong. As the day of young Rachel's first purification drew near, the unease grew stronger. She had heard the stories, the hushed conversations between adults who thought she wasn't listening, and though she tried to be brave, a seed of fear had taken root in her heart. The mikvah was calling, but what awaited her inside was not the cleansing she had been taught to expect. It was something far darker, something that would test the limits of her courage and faith. This is where our tale begins, at the threshold of the mikvah, where the line between the sacred and the curse begins to blur, and where a young girl's journey into terror is about to unfold. Rachel was a typical 13-year-old girl, full of curiosity and a yearning to belong. She lived in a small, tight-knit community where traditions were sacred, and everyone knew each other. Rachel had always been brave. She was the one who climbed the tallest trees, the one who dared to explore the darkest corners of the forest. But today, as her first purification at the mikvah approached, she felt a strange mix of emotions that she couldn't quite understand. This ritual was something she had been preparing for her entire life. It was a rite of passage, a moment when she would step into adulthood. Just like her mother, grandmother, and all the women in her family before her, Rachel had listened to their stories, watched them emerge from the mikvah with a serene glow, and longed for the day it would be her turn. Now, that day had come, but instead of excitement, she felt a knot of fear growing in her chest. The community Rachel belonged to was small but deeply rooted in its customs and beliefs. The mikvah was not just a building, it was a sacred space, a place of renewal and purification that held profound significance. Every woman in the community had visited the mikvah, and it was said that the waters held the prayers and hopes of generations. The townsfolk revered it, speaking of it in hushed, respectful tones. But lately, there had been a shift, a subtle change in the way people spoke about the mikvah. There were no longer just stories of spiritual cleansing, but whispers of something dark, something that didn't belong in such a holy place. The older women would exchange worried glances when the mikvah was mentioned, and the children had started avoiding the path that led to it, preferring to play elsewhere. Rachel noticed these things, but whenever she asked, the adults would quickly change the subject. Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She had overheard her parents speaking in low, anxious voices late at night, mentioning the mikvah and something about a presence. They never spoke directly to her about it, but she could tell they were worried. She tried to push the fear aside, telling herself it was just nerves. After all, this was supposed to be a happy occasion, a moment of joy and pride. Yet, the closer the day came, the more the unease grew. The mikvah, once a symbol of purity and tradition, now felt like a looming shadow over her thoughts. The water that had once seemed so inviting now felt cold and foreboding in her mind, as if it held secrets that were better left undiscovered. Rachel's feelings were a tangled mess. Part of her wanted to embrace the ritual with open arms, to step into the mikvah as a proud member of her community. But another part of her, a part that she couldn't ignore, was terrified. What if the whispers were true? What if the mikvah wasn't the place of safety and cleansing she had always believed it to be? Her mind kept going back to the fragments of conversation she had overheard, the tension in her parents' voices, and the way they looked at the mikvah now with something close to fear. She wanted to ask them, to demand answers, but she was too scared of what they might say. So she kept her fears to herself, trying to focus on the preparations. But the sense of dread only grew stronger. The day of Rachel's purification arrived, and the world outside seemed to mirror her feelings. The sky was overcast, heavy with clouds that threatened rain. A chill wind blew through the town, carrying with it the scent of earth and something else, something old and musty. Inside her home, the usual preparations were being made: fresh linens, prayers, and blessings, but there was an undercurrent of unease that no one could ignore. Rachel, dressed in the ceremonial white robe, her hands trembling slightly as she tied the belt. She looked at herself in the mirror, trying to see the young woman she was supposed to become today. But all she saw was a girl who was more frightened than she wanted to admit. As her family gathered to accompany her to the mikvah, Rachel felt the weight of their expectations, and something else, a sense that this day would change her life in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. And so, with a heart heavy with fear and doubt, Rachel stepped out of her home and began the short walk to the mikvah, unaware that what awaited her there would be more terrifying than anything she could have imagined. As Rachel and her family reached the mikvah, the sun was sinking low, casting long, eerie shadows across the ground. The building itself, usually a place of warmth and light, seemed to loom ominously before her. The once familiar path leading to its entrance felt foreign, and the air was thick with a coldness that didn't belong in the warmth of early evening. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest as she took a deep breath and stepped forward. The closer she got, the more the air seemed to press down on her, as if the very atmosphere was warning her to turn back. She glanced at her mother, who smiled reassuringly, but Rachel could see the tension in her eyes, the way her fingers tightened around the edge of her shawl. As they reached the entrance, Rachel paused. The door to the mikvah creaked open on its own, as if welcoming her or perhaps warning her. She tried to shake off the feeling of dread, telling herself it was just nerves, but the whispers began as soon as she stepped inside. They were faint at first, barely audible, but they seemed to come from all directions. Rachel looked around, expecting to see someone there, but the hallway was empty. The shadows seemed to dance along the walls, flickering as the dim lights struggled to keep them at bay. She felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up and quickened her pace, eager to be done with the ritual and away from this unsettling place. As she entered the mikvah room, the whispers grew louder. Rachel's gaze was drawn to the pool at the center of the room, the mikvah itself. The water, which was supposed to be clear and inviting, was murky and dark, almost black. It rippled, even though there was no breeze, and the sight of it sent a shiver down her spine. She hesitated at the edge of the water, her breath catching in her throat. This wasn't right. The mikvah wasn't supposed to look like this, to feel like this. She could sense something malevolent lurking beneath the surface, something that didn't belong. But when she turned to her mother, the older woman simply nodded, her face a mask of calm that didn't reach her eyes. With a final, shaky breath, Rachel stepped into the water. The cold hit her like a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. She forced herself to wade deeper, her heart pounding louder with each step. The water clung to her like icy hands, and the whispers grew louder, swirling around her, filling her ears with unintelligible words that carried a sense of urgency, of warning. Suddenly, something brushed against her leg, cold and slimy. Rachel gasped, freezing in place. She looked down, but the water was too dark to see anything beneath the surface. She tried to convince herself it was just her imagination, but then it happened again. This time more forcefully, as if something was pulling at her, trying to drag her under. Panic surged through her, and she struggled to stay upright. She could feel the presence in the water now, something ancient and angry, something that didn't want her there. The whispers turned into low, menacing growls, and the shadows on the walls seemed to close in around her. Rachel knew she had to get out, but her legs felt like lead. The water pulled at her, and she could barely move. Desperate, she summoned all her strength and lunged toward the edge of the mikvah, her hands clawing at the slippery tiles. She managed to pull herself out, collapsing on the cold floor, gasping for air. For a moment, she lay there, trembling, the whispers still echoing in her ears. When she finally found the courage to look back at the water, it was calm and still, as if nothing had happened. But Rachel knew better. She had felt the darkness, the anger that lurked beneath the surface, and she knew it wasn't going to let her go easily. Her mother helped her to her feet, her expression unreadable. Rachel could see the fear in her eyes now, the fear that mirrored her own. As they left the mikvah, Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed her out, something that wasn't going to let her escape its grasp so easily. The ritual was over, but Rachel's ordeal had just begun. The mikvah had marked her, and whatever was trapped within it wasn't going to rest until it had taken what it wanted. The days that followed Rachel's terrifying experience at the mikveh were a blur of fear and confusion. She tried to return to normal life, to forget what had happened, but the memories clung to her like a shadow. At night, she would lie awake in her bed, listening to the sounds of the house settling, every creak and groan sending a jolt of fear through her. The whispers from the mikveh still echoed in her mind, growing louder and more insistent as the days went by. Her parents noticed the change in her, but when they asked what was wrong, Rachel couldn't bring herself to tell them the truth. How could she explain the darkness she had felt, the cold hands that had tried to drag her under? She was afraid they wouldn't believe her, or worse, that they would confirm her fears. So she kept silent, her fear growing like a poison inside her. At school, Rachel found it hard to concentrate. Her friends tried to include her in their usual games and conversations, but she felt distant, disconnected from the world around her. The more she tried to ignore the events at the mikveh, the more they seemed to consume her thoughts. She began to notice strange things happening around her, shadows that moved on their own, objects that weren't where she remembered leaving them, and that ever present cold, no matter where she went. One night, the nightmares began. Rachel dreamed of the mikveh, of the dark water that seemed to reach out for her, pulling her down into its depths. She saw faces in the water, twisted and tormented, their mouths open in silent screams. Each night, the dreams grew more vivid, more terrifying, until Rachel was afraid to sleep at all. The lack of rest took its toll on her, and she became pale and withdrawn, her eyes haunted by the things she had seen. Desperate for answers, Rachel began to investigate the history of the mikveh. She visited the town's library, poring over old records and newspapers, looking for anything that might explain what she had experienced. What she found only deepened her fear. Many years ago, long before Rachel was born, there had been an accident at the mikveh. A young woman, much like herself, had drowned during her purification ritual. The circumstances were mysterious. Some said she had slipped. Others whispered that something had pulled her under. The community had mourned her loss, but over time, the tragedy had been forgotten, buried beneath layers of tradition and silence. But Rachel knew better. The whispers she had heard, the cold presence in the water, it was the spirit of the woman who had died, trapped in the mikveh, unable to find peace. Rachel began to understand that the spirit was angry, vengeful, and that it had latched onto her, drawn to her fear and her innocence. Determined to find a way to rid herself of the haunting, Rachel sought out the only person who might believe her, a reclusive old woman named Miriam, who lived on the outskirts of town. Miriam was known for her knowledge of the old ways, of things that others preferred to forget. She had once been a respected member of the community, but over time, her strange practices and refusal to conform had led to her being shunned. Rachel had heard stories about Miriam, tales of curses and dark magic, but she was too desperate to care. She found Miriam's house, a small, weathered cottage hidden among the trees, and knocked on the door. It creaked open slowly, revealing the old woman, her eyes sharp and knowing. Miriam listened as Rachel told her story, her face expressionless. When Rachel finished, the old woman nodded slowly, as if she had expected this. She told Rachel that the mikveh had indeed been cursed, tainted by the tragic death of the young woman. The spirit had become trapped, unable to move on, and it had grown bitter and twisted over the years. To free herself from the spirit's grip, Miriam explained, Rachel would need to confront it directly. She would have to return to the mikveh and perform a ritual of her own, one that would cleanse the water and release the spirit from its torment. But it wouldn't be easy. The spirit was strong, and it would resist. Rachel's heart sank at the thought of returning to the mikveh, but she knew she had no choice. The haunting was growing stronger, and if she didn't do something soon, she feared she would be consumed by it. With Miriam's guidance, Rachel prepared for the ritual, gathering the herbs, candles, and other items the old woman said she would need. The night of the ritual was dark and cold, the wind howling through the trees as Rachel made her way back to the mikveh. She was alone, just as Miriam had instructed, her footsteps echoing eerily in the stillness of the night. The building loomed ahead of her, even more foreboding than before. Rachel could feel the spirit's presence, waiting for her, angry and restless. She entered the mikveh room, her heart pounding in her chest. The water was still dark, still rippling with unseen movement. Rachel hesitated for only a moment before she began the ritual, lighting the candles and placing the herbs in the water. She spoke the words Miriam had taught her, her voice trembling at first, but growing stronger as she continued. As she chanted, the air around her grew colder, and the whispers returned, louder and more insistent than ever. The water began to churn, as if something beneath the surface was struggling to break free. Rachel forced herself to keep going, even as fear threatened to overwhelm her. She could feel the spirit's anger, its hatred, but she didn't stop. Finally, with a final, desperate cry, Rachel completed the ritual. The candles flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. For a moment, there was silence, then a terrible, ear-piercing scream filled the air, echoing off the walls. Rachel clapped her hands over her ears, dropping to her knees as the sound reverberated through her body. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The water in the mikvah was still, the air calm. Rachel looked up, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The oppressive weight that had hung over her since that first night was gone. The spirit, it seemed, had been released. Exhausted but relieved, Rachel slowly got to her feet. She had done it. The haunting was over, or so she hoped. But as she left the mikvah for the last time, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching her, lurking in the shadows, waiting. Rachel's relief was short-lived. In the days following the ritual, she tried to convince herself that the nightmare was finally over. She no longer felt the cold presence that had haunted her, and the whispers had faded into silence. But something still felt wrong, a lingering unease that she couldn't shake. One evening, as Rachel was preparing for bed, she caught a glimpse of something in the corner of her room, a shadow that didn't belong. It was fleeting, almost imperceptible, but it sent a chill down her spine. She turned on the light, but the shadow was gone, dismissing it as her imagination. Rachel tried to push the fear away, but that night, the nightmares returned, more vivid and terrifying than before. In the dream, Rachel was back at the mikveh, but this time, the water was boiling, churning violently. The room was filled with an unnatural, suffocating heat, and the walls seemed to close in around her. She heard the scream again, the same one from the night of the ritual, but it was louder, angrier. The spirit wasn't gone, it was furious. Rachel woke up in a cold sweat, her heart racing. She realized then that the ritual hadn't worked as she had hoped. The spirit hadn't been freed, it had been enraged. And now, it wanted revenge. Determined to end the nightmare once and for all, Rachel decided to return to the mikveh, this time without Miriam's help. She knew she had to face the spirit alone. Armed with only her courage and the knowledge she had gained, she made her way back to the mikveh under the cover of night. As she entered the mikveh room, the air was thick with tension. The water was calm, but Rachel could feel the anger simmering beneath the surface. She stepped to the edge of the mikveh and, with a deep breath, called out to the spirit. "I'm not afraid of you," Rachel said, her voice trembling. "I know what you are, and I know what you want. But you can't have it. You need to move on." The water began to ripple, then churned violently. The room grew colder, and the shadows danced on the walls, growing larger, more menacing. The spirit's presence was overwhelming, but Rachel stood her ground. "You don't belong here," Rachel continued, forcing herself to stay calm. "You need to let go." For a moment, it seemed as if the spirit would lash out, dragging her into the water. But then the churning stopped. The room grew eerily quiet, the air heavy with anticipation. Rachel held her breath, waiting. Suddenly, the water erupted in a final, violent burst, spraying across the room. Rachel staggered back, shielding her face. But when she looked again, the water was calm, clear for the first time since that fateful day. The oppressive presence that had haunted her was gone. The spirit had finally moved on. Exhausted and shaken, Rachel knew that she had won. The mikveh was no longer a place of fear, it was once again a place of purification. But Rachel also knew that she would never forget what had happened and the lesson it had taught her. Sometimes the most sacred places hide the darkest secrets. The following morning, the sun rose over the town, casting a warm, golden light that seemed to chase away the lingering shadows. Rachel felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in weeks. The mikveh, once a source of dread, now seemed to have returned to its rightful place as a sanctuary of cleansing and renewal. The darkness that had plagued it was gone, and with it, the oppressive fear that had gripped Rachel's heart. she visited the mikvah one last time, this time in daylight. The water was clear, sparkling in the sunlight that streamed through the windows. The room felt warm, inviting a far cry from the cold, haunted place it had been. Rachel stood at the edge of the pool, looking down at her reflection. She wasn't the same girl who had stood here weeks ago, trembling with fear. She had faced the darkness and emerged stronger, wiser. The community began to notice the change in the mikvah as well. The unease that had settled over the town slowly lifted, and people began to speak of the mikvah with reverence once again. Rachel knew she couldn't share the full story of what had happened. Some things were better left unsaid, but she felt a quiet pride in knowing that she had played a part in restoring peace to the sacred place. As she walked away from the mikvah, Rachel felt a sense of closure. The spirit had been laid to rest, and life could return to normal. But she would never forget the lessons she had learned, that even the most sacred places could harbor darkness, and that true strength came from facing one's fears head-on. Rachel smiled to herself as she returned home, the sunlight warming her face. The terror was over, but the memory of it would stay with her, a reminder of the courage it took to stand against the darkness and the light that awaited on the other side. Rachel's story is a chilling reminder that the most sacred places can sometimes harbor the darkest secrets. Have you ever encountered something unexplainable? Share your own ghostly experiences in the comments below and join our community of brave souls who dare to explore the unknown. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more terrifying tales. And if you enjoyed Rachel's journey, check out our latest horror story, because the darkness is always closer than you think.